That's really one of the most unspoken but practical realities of transformation, which is not everybody's going to make it to the end of the journey. They're either going to opt out because, to Rick's point, they're not open to the change, or they might not have the skills and capabilities needed at the other end of the transformation.
Welcome to This is Digital, a podcast brought to you by West Monroe. Join us as we talk to leading experts about bringing the digital mindset to your organization.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to This is Digital, a podcast where we talk about what it means to move from analog to digital ways of working. I'm your host, Rissa Redden, Chief Marketing Officer at West Monroe. At West Monroe, we help businesses be digital. But what does that mean, and how do you define digital? At its core, digital is a connected mindset and way of working across all aspects of your business. However, our team knows that digital can be interpreted in so many ways. That's why, as you listen to This is Digital, you hear different definitions of what digital means to us and to our guests. West Monroe surveyed 700 executives across 7 key industries, along with 5,000 consumers, to develop our new report, The Digital Disconnect, Linking Vision to Real-World Execution. We found that overall, organizations are focused on being digital and becoming more digitally agile, but still have room to improve when it comes to meeting customer demand, beefing up their data and analytics capabilities, and ensuring team alignment. In the first episode of our 3-part series on the digital disconnect, we're going to focus on how organizations are aligning their employees on digital vision. If you'd like to follow along in the report, you can. You can find it at westmonroe.com/digital disconnect. Our data found that people, processes, and organizational structure continue to be the biggest gap between a company's stated digital vision and its actual execution, with 47% of executives stating that less than half of their employees have not fully embraced digital. And as we see the responsibility for executing digital strategy becoming increasingly ambiguous, companies may soon see an impact on their success. Joining us today, we have Kim Seals and Rick Sabatino from West Monroe, and both will dive deeper into the organization and people section of our report. Kim and Rick, welcome to This is Digital. I would love to hear about your background and your professional journey that leads you to this moment. And Kim, could we start with you?
Sure. Hi, Rissa. Thanks so much for having me. I've spent the last 30 plus years of my career in people-related roles. So either working in HR functions as an HR generalist, a head of total rewards, or as a consultant in what's typically known as an HR transformation type discipline. So I've worked with our clients on a number of topics about how to most effectively motivate and engage their people and how to successfully deliver their HR programs across the organization.
Fantastic. Rick?
Thanks, Rissa. It's good to be here. I started out my career a little differently. I started in technology and did that for about 5 years, but grew increasingly frustrated with our inability to transform, to change people's behaviors, to adopt the tools and approaches that we were implementing, and catching them doing their workarounds and not trusting the systems. And so I paused my career, went back and studied more on the people side. And since then, I've spent about the last 20 years doing organizational design, development, and change, and looking at how do we move the behaviors and move the organizational patterns away from the old ways of working and into the new ways of working to take advantage of the ever-evolving tool set, and in this case, the digital tool set and mindset.
Well, and Rick, a follow-up question for you there. I mean, did you have a moment where you were working on a project and you thought, oh, there's got to be a better way, that led you to that pivot to being more focused on change management and people?
It was kind of a confluence of an opportunity arose to go to just what was the perfect program for what I had been wrestling with in my own head, but also I was working with a small payroll company, and we were building a new module for the payroll system. And you could summarize all the requirements as, look, you just need to do it the way we do it today. And I knew it wasn't going to get any better if we just implemented the current state in a new tool. And I think that's actually one of the challenges we talk about, the digital disconnect, right? We're going to talk about that today. The vision and the mindset have to change before you make the requirements. Otherwise, you just build the current state in a new tool.
So in your experience as a people consultant, what are some common challenges? I mean, I think you just described one, Rick, but what are some common challenges or obstacles that companies face when aligning their workforce to more digital processes or ways of working? Kim, could we start with you?
Sure. And I'd love to build off something Rick just said about how we just sort of pick up the old ways we do things and just hope they'll become digital in the future, right? And one of the biggest disconnects that I see organizations face is they don't change the rewards and recognition systems that are in place to incentivize those behaviors, like Rick was talking about, right? So if you haven't aligned the behaviors that you need from your team, collaboration, risk-taking, agility, having a customer centricity mindset. If you're not rewarding those behaviors, whether it's in your actual reward programs or in how you recognize and promote people, then they're not going to change their behaviors. They're going to keep doing the things that they get rewarded to do in the year-end cycle. And then the other thing I'll talk about that I think is super important is career mobility. And how do you create these opportunities for employees to not just move up a career ladder, but maybe move side to side and work on different, fun, engaging projects that allow them to learn new skills, develop. And I'd like to say these days our careers are rock walls. They're not career ladders, right? So do I get as an employee a set of experiences and an opportunity to work on things that excite me, engage me? And it's not just how can I think about that next level up promotion? And so that's why I think it's so critical what Rick was talking about. You can't just hope that your employees come along on this journey as you try to become more digital. You have to actually engage them and make sure they understand why this matters to them and what it means to their careers and how they're recognized.
How is your company leveraging generative AI? If you're trying to get the most out of this new technology, check out West Monroe's new video podcast called This is AI. Our AI experts show you real examples of how to use AI for the best results. You can find This is AI on YouTube and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Well, and Kim, I love that idea of a rock wall as an analogy for development. And, if you were to take that analogy even a little bit farther, it's almost, you need the harness and you need the ropes and the ability to belay. Like you need the support in order to feel confident about scaling that rock wall, right? And what's the company's role? What's the person's role to create that sort of, not scaffolding, but the systems to support that development?
For sure. And it comes down to culture, right? Which I think we'll probably deep dive into a little bit in today's conversation as well. Have you created the culture for employees to take those risks? Do I know that if I get up on that rock wall and I make a misstep, that there's something that's going to be there for me as a way to help me understand it's not the end of my career if we go try something new and it doesn't work, or maybe we learn something from it, but it's not quite what we were thinking. So we pivot quickly and we go do the thing that's going to make us successful. So have you created that culture that allows that fail fast environment, that it's okay if I take measured risks? The organization is here to support me. Think about that from the rock wall analogy about how are we supporting you on that rock wall. And, I see a lot of organizations that they put employees in these stretch roles, or they ask them to take on these new challenges. And then maybe it doesn't quite work out like we thought. And then that employee feels sort of stranded, right? Like, do I have to leave the organization now because my project didn't work? Is there a role for me to come back into my organization that I left from to go do this assignment? So that's all the systems that we need to put in place for employees to feel comfortable about what it means to take a risk. And if I step to the side to take on this new project, how can I still advance up in the future? Like, what does that path look like for me? And it all comes together in terms of that culture and how you're setting up the employees to really be a part of the journey.
Kim, you're reminding me of an episode of This is Digital that we had with Betsy Ziegler from 1871. And she described failure presentations. And she would have the team meeting lead off with what was a failure. And because the importance wasn't that we failed, it was what did we learn from this experience. But it became this sort of celebration of failure, which I thought sounded fascinating.
Well, so I have to tell you, because now you've reminded me, I went to this party at this point last year that was a failure party. And we had to walk in the room and we had to write on our name tag something we failed at in 2022, right? And I'm assuming we're going to have the party again this year because it was so much fun. It was so freeing. It was like, yeah, I didn't get everything right. But I'm going to celebrate these failures because they taught me something that will help me for the next year.
That's amazing. Was that a professional setting, or
It was.
it more of a personal setting?
No, it was a professional setting,
right?
It is. It is. And you were warned in advance. Like when you walk in the door, we're going to ask you about a failure and you're going to have to write it down. And I can tell you, I stressed a bit about what was I going to be willing to admit, but it was a lot of fun. And it really created so many conversations that people were having as you were networking across the room, and that it's okay to fail in the pursuit of something bigger and better. Like, what did you learn and how are you going to take that failure and propel yourself forward?
Well, and I would suspect, did you see anybody that had a similar failure to yours? I would think it would create a connection and a very strong conversation right out of the gate, given the shared experience.
It would, but I would say the differences were in how we described that failure on the name tag, right? So when you get under the covers of it, yes, it was probably a similar failure, but like we are all sort of trying to put our best foot forward on what our failure was on our name tag.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Rick, let's go to you. I would love to hear your perspective on what are some common challenges or obstacles that companies face when aligning their workforce to more digital processes or ways of working.
It starts from the very beginning and what the vision is. And a lot of organizations, they may have the vision for what they want to do, but what's on the other side of it? And really making sure that they're kind of following all the way through to what they're making possible and communicating that clearly. Organizations are really collective conversations, right? We exist as an organization because we're talking about the same things and we're talking about the same goals. And the more aligned our conversations are in the organization, the more effective we can be. In fact, I think as we've gone through, COVID and remote work and becoming more distributed, our conversations are what holds us together because many of us aren't even in an office together anymore, or we're having conversations, with more distributed parties. And so if we can't change those conversations, we fail. And so a vision needs to be not just some buzzwords, but a really compelling picture of what life is like on the other side of what's inevitably a messy process. Transformation is never clean or straightforward, as Kim pointed out, right? You have to have permission to fail. You have to have permission to screw things up. You can't succeed at a digital transformation if you're going to make it seem like it's a life or death sort of exercise for the organization. You have to have room to play because that's where we learn, that's where we innovate. And so making sure those conversations are being had, changing the nature of the conversations and really shifting that is key to getting it going. And that's where, it feeds into the requirements. It feeds into all the other initiatives and it propels the energy of the organization towards that vision.
Well, and Rick, I want to ask you a follow-up question. So you mentioned the importance of a compelling vision. How do you assess how compelling a vision is? Or how do you, give guidance? Given how critical the vision is, how do you coach somebody on what compelling looks like?
Compelling, it requires it to be concrete. If I want to be able to have everyone picture something. Sometimes we create these visions and they're exciting, but they're really hiding a lot of misalignment. It's broad enough that everyone can get behind it and say, yeah, I'm on board. And at the end of the day, they're maybe not on board. And to give you an example, we were facilitating a vision and value workshop with a group of executives. And as we're kicking it off, I can see the CEO becoming a bit agitated. And just before we dive in to the first round of exercises, he interrupts and says, "Look, I think we all know why we're here. We know what we have to do. Why do we need to go through this process? We all have the same vision." And the CFO chimed in total agreement. He says, "Yes, if we do this, it's going to create A, B, and C." And one of the things he says, and it's going to reduce our trucking miles. And the VP of logistics looked at both of them a little funny and said, wait a minute, if we do this right, it's going to increase our trucking miles. And, it's going to reduce our real estate spend because we're going to have more centralized distribution. And that's going to increase our trucking miles. And that's where we're going to save our money. And the three of them started going back and forth on this for a good 5 to 10 minutes. And I just let them. And they really started to see they're not aligned. And so kind of compelling has it has an element of inspiration, but it also has, it needs to be detailed enough that you know what you're going to get on it. And everyone can sign off and say, yes, I'm going to build that, and not, I'm going to go build something.
Okay, a little bit about the research that we conducted. Our research found that only 21% of organizations say the full C-suite is accountable for digital transformation, while 29% said it's the responsibility of a separate transformation team. Why is it important for the full C-suite to own digital? And what steps can executives take to help disperse accountability for digital transformation throughout their organizations? Who would like to tackle that one first?
I'll share a few thoughts, and then because it ties in nicely to what Rick has already said around a shared vision and having all of the employees along on the same journey, right? And if you've just got one executive or one group that's responsible for this transformation that's going to likely affect the entire organization, then you don't really have that shared ownership, that clear vision, and those things that are necessary to achieve whatever the end state is you're headed to. What is that final destination? And you have to be careful about this, because while there needs to be a shared vision, there's also got to be clear accountability, like who owns what piece of this journey. And each of our groups, each of our functional areas within the organization has a role to play here. So all of the leadership has to be aligned on what that vision is. And then how does each function, area, department, whatever it might be, play a role in achieving that vision? And then can the employees, do they have line of sight to how what they do every day gets to whatever that end result is, right? So you have to make those connections. And that's why I think the change management work upfront is so important to set that vision, align on it. Everybody's accountable. Everybody's got the same shared vision. We all are accountable, but then we have our pieces that we know that we own. And that reduces confusion, minimizes risk, and helps you achieve what you're trying to achieve.
Rick, anything to add?
Yeah, I think digital transformations really, if they're done well, affect so many dimensions of the organization that it's hard to have that done separately. And the C-suite is responsible, right, for the health and the care and the feeding of the entire organization. And digital transformation touches so many pieces that it's hard to move that out into another group to kind of cook it up and then deploy it back into the organization. A lot of times, from a change perspective, that'll be viewed with suspicion by the folks who are supposedly receiving, being told, okay, now we're going to transform, and here's what you're going to do. They've been running the business in the meantime, and how are they going to transform? And so a lot of times they end up punching holes in what's been done over kind of in this incubator, and so they don't have skin in the game, so they move into a protective, resistant posture, and they may get labeled as resistant, but they also may have some very good points. A lot of times, people resisting change do have the organization's best interests at heart, and the people who are resisting have information that the team doing the transforming didn't have, and vice versa. And so you can invest a lot of money in building something and then have a really hard time getting it out in the organization and lose velocity or have poor adoption at that point because it was separated out. And so I think the C-suite is accountable for the digital. It needs to be accountable for the digital transformation, and then holding their people all accountable so that it's truly the organization that's accountable for the transformation and is dividing and conquering that, and it's not being done somewhere else.
A question for you, Kim. How does organizational structure of a company matter to accountability?
I think it matters a lot, right? Because you've got to have the organizational structure that doesn't inhibit collaboration, right? One of the biggest reasons why these types of digital transformation efforts don't succeed is a lack of collaboration, a lack of flexibility or adaptability in the structure that promotes that collaboration and connectivity you need for the entire organization to be a part of this journey, right? So it starts with that org structure, removing those barriers, removing those silos, but then you've got to take it down to the team levels. Do you have cross-functional teams that are aligned on how they're driving value, how they're achieving these results, and what their role is and the role that they play? And so you've got to have it right both at the org structure level in terms of accountability, but then also at the teams. What are their roles and how does this all play in? The org structure is key to ensuring collaboration and reducing and minimizing those silos that are going to prevent the success.
So a follow-up question for you there. I just read a piece and I found it fascinating from HBR, from the Harvard Business Review, on sources of burnout, which is a big topic right now. And one of the sources that was cited in this article was collaboration as a cause of burnout. What's your reaction to that? I mean, I think there's a difference too between, are you driving consensus or is it collaboration? Like the words matter, right?
Right. And when I say collaboration, I mean things like if my team has an expertise that Rick and his team could use to be more successful, are we able to collaborate? And the expertise that I have on my team is something I can share with Rick's team and vice versa, right? Collaboration doesn't mean everybody gets involved in every little thing, right? Because I think that's what leads to the burnout, was we're all trying to do everything. We're all running around just trying to be successful. But how do we actually collaborate in a way that's efficient, effective, and makes the best use of the skills and capabilities, but doesn't require Rick to go build a bigger team because he had to replace the expertise that my team had, when if we could just take out those barriers and Rick and I are incentivized to collaborate and connect, then I'm like, Rick, I've got somebody on my team that knows that. Can we add them to your project team in a way that's helpful? And so I think there's sometimes a misunderstood definition of collaboration, which, if not done correctly, could lead to a lot of people doing a lot of things, a lot of duplication of effort, a lot of people running hard, but maybe they're not achieving anything.
Okay, next question. In a similar vein, buy-in. How do you attract or recruit the buy-in needed for digital transformation? Rick, you want to try that one?
Buy-in is incredibly important in some regards and lesser in others. And so a big part of making sure you've got a good strategy around a digital transformation is thinking through who are the stakeholder groups in the organization and what level of impact is each group going to have? What level of support do I need from each group to be successful? There are some groups that may be very low impact, but are going to be very necessary to the success of the project. And similarly, there may be folks who have high impact, and whether or not they support it, they're going to have a high impact, but it'll be successful whether or not they support it. And so segmenting your stakeholder groups in your organization, and sometimes even into, if you have a broader enterprise, to your partners, your vendors, and other stakeholders outside the organization, understanding who do I need to keep an eye on, who do I just need to keep informed, who do I need to maybe engage a little more, and where do I need to really engage deeply, to prioritize my outreach efforts and to cultivate that buy-in, and then to monitor the health of that. Some organizations, they'll do a stakeholder analysis and then it sits on the shelf and they move on, and they're not monitoring that. And so the environment in the organization is continually evolving. And so making sure that the leaders stay engaged with the right stakeholders and are having the right conversations to move things along, and that the people who need to be informed are being informed and not overwhelmed with it, and just really tailoring that campaign and segmenting it out within your organization so that you're not just carpet bombing the whole organization with the same communication campaign and hoping that everyone just gets on board, but really tailoring it and using influence and not just authority to drive the digital transformation.
A follow-up question for you there. When you think about that segmentation exercise, I suspect that if you were to ask people what role they want to play, they might want to be very involved. And that might be a different role than you want for them to play on a given initiative. How do you navigate that? I mean, there are politics, right? And how do you ensure that you get to the outcome that's most important for the organization?
This can be an activity that we'll at times spend weeks interviewing stakeholders and stakeholder groups, understanding what are their priorities, what are their business mandates, what are their expectations. How will they be affected by this element of the change? How do they like to be communicated to? And there may be hard conversations about like, okay, this is going to be your role in the transformation. And so making sure that we are having those difficult conversations, because right, some people may have aspirations to be involved in ways that aren't really what the organization needs. And so this is a hard leadership job. This is why we need the C-suite and strong leadership in a transformation like this, so that it stays cohesive and it stays integrated into the organization, and that buy-in is clear. Because what you can't have is a separate audience to go to, right? Like, this is our priority, and we're doing it together. And so those leaders need to be having those conversations, or when those conversations are had, having the backs of the people having those conversations to level set, to direct. And these sound like really bread and butter. These aren't really any crazy concepts for digital. They're just the hard work of managing and leading. And when leaders get disengaged, that's when it starts to go off the track.
If I could just add one thing to that, Rissa, I think also so key to understand who are going to be your detractors through this process up front, and give them a specific role that forces them to engage, right? And
Detractor?
Be a part. Yeah,
Is
the
there
detractors,
like
right? I don't know if that's
Okay.
on Rick's
No.
scorecard, but we could add it.
No.
But really just understanding, to the point that Rick made earlier about collaboration, right? And people who are influencers and connectors, is understanding, there's always the way we communicate in an organization, and then there's the real way we communicate in an organization, right? And how information gets out into the system and who's driving those messages. And we as leaders know who those people are, and we know how they are going to use their informal networks to influence the buy-in of others in the organization, right? So doing that work up front to determine who those people are, and then engaging them in whatever your change champion network is going to be, or however you're going to do that, and making sure they've got a role up front that you can help influence and direct, so that they're not out there, just really sort of doing away with all the good work you're doing to try to get buy-in. They're, what's the word? They're like, sort of manipulating that behind the scenes, or detracting from that work, if you will, right? And so I think it's important to give those folks tasks and specific accountabilities here as well, because it's human nature to say, I know that, Susie or John they're never going to get engaged, and they're never going to be on board. So let me just put them over here, and I'm going to work with the people that will engage. And then you have to go back and figure out how to manage their impact that they're having on the organization if you didn't include them up front.
How would you operationalize that? So I think it's one thing to recognize, okay, we've got some detractors and we need to manage them perhaps in a different way. But how do you engage? I mean, it's not like you would set up a meeting and say, I understand you're going to be a detractor for us, and so we're going to give you some things. Like, how do you engage? Like, you're a critical piece of this puzzle. Like, how would you walk me through what that conversation would look like?
Yeah, an example of an actual project, right? We sat down with the VP of operations every week, and we had a secret version of the org chart that had kind of the sentiment of everyone in the top 4 layers of the organization marked, and we'd go through week on week and say, okay, where's this at? Where's this person trending? And then we would sit down and plot out, okay, when do you meet with this person? I'm going to be in this meeting. Okay, what are your talking points for that meeting? How are you going to influence it? And there were some cases, difficult conversations, where it was that one-on-one conversation you alluded to, Rissa, which was like, hey, this is where we're going. Help me understand why you're fighting it so hard, because we're going there. And then really listening and hearing that person out. And that actually happened. And it actually took that level of directness and to be heard. And that person raised a few good points that changed the approach. And once we incorporated that, the leader flipped that detractor into an advocate. And that was incredibly powerful for the velocity in the organization, the velocity of the change. Because once that detractor becomes a supporter, they can be incredibly empowering to the rest of the organization. And for the organization to see someone change their mind, to see that someone had the safety of speaking out and saying, I don't agree, and that they were listened to by a leader and that they saw that change, that's gold when it comes to really navigating an organizational change. And and like gold, it's just hard to mine, and it takes a lot of patience.
And I think sometimes those detractors do just want to be acknowledged and heard, right? And so to your point, Rissa, I know you were kind of joking about, do we sit them down and say how important they are? We actually do, right? In that conversation, you're a critical part of this change journey. And we know you have a contrary point of view. We want to hear it. We want to understand it. But at the end of this, they've got to get on board, right? And that's also part of the message to them, is this train has left the station. And that's why it's so important for leadership to all be engaged as well. And I've actually been on a call in a project we had a senior leader that was making a material transformational change to the organization. And he had all of his direct reports on a call, and he had probably 60 to 70% engagement and about 30% detractors. And he said, I've heard you all. I've made my decision, and now we move forward as a team. And this is what it means for us to move forward as a team. And every one of those detractors, they appreciated the bluntness of the message, the directness. They were heard. Everybody understands that they were not necessarily engaged in what this was going to be. But as a leadership team, we leave this room and we move forward as one. And we have the same messages. So being that direct.
I think the direct is critical, and I love that example, Kim. Mm-hmm. However, what about the back channeling? There's one thing to be in a meeting and everybody nods their heads and says, "Oh yes, this is exactly what we're going to do, and this is the path forward." And then they go back to their offices and keep doing it the way they've always done it. I mean, how do you approach something like that?
You call out the behavior when you catch it, right? I mean, it does take those difficult conversations over and over, right? As Rick said, bringing them in and saying, hey, we agreed we were going to be on the same page, and now we understand these other messages are out there. And it's that culture of accountability. It's that cycle of feedback. And this change management is not one and done, right? It is an ongoing iterative cycle of conversations, communication, connection. And that leader's team knows that he or she was serious when they said it's time for everybody to get on board, and I'm going to call out the bad behavior when I see it.
There's also an opportunity to create safe paths for those people who are just not interested in getting on board. We worked with a client over the past 5 years, and when they were starting out on their transformation journey, they 350 people in the technology organization, and most of them don't have the skills to go where they need to go. So start out figuring out what are the skills they need, what are the gaps. But then we developed a program where we brought everyone in IT in small groups and essentially said, here's the vision of where we're going. And the leaders shared kind of their personal visions for themselves and their careers. And we then cascaded it down and said, what's your vision for the next few years in your career? And we spent time exploring their skills and their skill gaps. They knew what the organization's vision was. We basically said, look, there's a place for you if you want it. And if your vision for yourself and your career aligns with the organization and you can get something out of it and help us achieve that, we will invest in you. But we intentionally worked with our HR team to message, if this is not the vision you have, then let's see how you can help us move along, and we'll help you find that next place to go and that next place to land, and created an opening in the conversation for a safe exit. And that took out the need for folks to fight it and to be passive aggressive in it, because they knew they would get support if they just raised their hand and said, hey, this isn't for me. And they weren't going to be kicked out the door that day, but that they would have a thoughtful plan to get that. And then that gave the organization room to bring in the talent with the skills and the aspirations that were aligned. And so in that case, it was really a vulnerable conversation for the organization to have, because they were very disciplined in the way they wanted to take on this change, because it's high risk for them because of the business they're in. They didn't have the leeway of having it not be successful. And so they had to go slow on their digital transformation, and very thoughtfully and very systematically. So, starting with moving the workforce and getting the workforce ready. And then we work together to think through not just the organizational structure, but what is the operating model and the interaction model that needs to be had to Kim's point earlier, right? The conversations, the collaboration, making sure all that was aligned with the process, and really moving them through and going slow on that transformation journey so that they could come out the other side. And, outside the organization, it'll look really fast. But inside the organization, it was a longer game, because they were really managing every risk, but that caused them to do a really thoughtful, disciplined.
That's really one of the most unspoken but practical realities of transformation, which is not everybody's going to make it to the end of the journey. They're either going to opt out because, to Rick's point, they're not open to the change, or they might not have the skills and capabilities needed at the other end of the transformation. And when we're talking to leaders about this transformation, when we're engaged and we start this project, we have those conversations to say, you want to bring everybody along, but the reality is you're probably not. And so what does success look like here? And if we we need to plan for some of the folks that are not going to make it, do they have any unique skills or capabilities that we have to make sure we know how to replace, right? And how are we proactively managing the risk that we're creating for the organization by being on this transformation journey that not everybody either wants to go on or is capable of going on?
Well, that leads me to my next question. At West Monroe, we recently wrote about how companies have been investing heavily in technology and data, but are leaving the human part for later. Now, based on this conversation, I feel like I would answer that question as, well, that's because the human part is harder. It is harder work. Based on what I'm hearing from the two of you. But I'd love your perspective on that. Why are companies investing heavily in tech and data, but leaving the human part out?
It's uncomfortable, right? I think it's hard. It's nuanced, right? People are not just pieces of technology or pieces of data. They are actual people with a range of emotions and skills and capabilities, and you have to approach this with nuance and with thoughtfulness and with directness, right? And that may not be something that everybody's comfortable with, and so they sometimes will tend to leave it for the last. Let's do these other parts first because we can just go buy a new piece of technology or we can clean up our data. But then how do we think about our people and the role they play on this journey?
What's the outcome then? So by prioritizing the spend on data and tech and not on people, I would think that could be money not well spent then, or you're not going to see the full value of that investment. But what would be some other potential pitfalls?
Of not investing in the people first. That is, I think our research has shown us that one of the biggest reasons why these transformation efforts fail is because of the people that were not aligned on the shared vision, the shared accountability, all the things that we've been talking about, right? So you've got to get that done, that piece of work done up front, and then keep people at the forefront of this throughout. That's going to be the key. But I think all the things we've already talked about really show you what the risk is if you don't prioritize the people in this.
The reality is, roughly around 30% of the time, these initiatives are successful in achieving their outcomes. And that's been a pretty consistent statistic for, the last 20 years. We've always done it that way, right? We swap out the technology, we change the process, and then we train people to do it. As we got into the war for talent, over the last few years, and the talent markets became constrained, it got harder and harder to just bring in new people. So I think that exacerbated the difficulties with transformation, and that's why we saw so much buzz around upskilling and really started getting more awareness around investing in the workforce, because you couldn't just go hire another person to just fill that space. They weren't lining up for those jobs. Those markets have changed a little bit now. Hopefully the lessons stick, because when we see taking the people, the process, and the technology together, not sequentially, you're taking a little bit of a more holistic transformation and can be a bit more thoughtful. So upskilling your people so that they can do the transformation, not after the transformation has landed. It can make a difference in so many dimensions of adopting the change and sustaining the change. Because when we talk about the transformation, right, when the project is over, the change really begins for the organization. And now it's on the people to keep that change in place and to really drive the value out of that change. So the technology is installed, but people using it are what's going to make the difference. People enacting those processes. And the people get left to the end because that's just kind of the way it's always been done. And I think digital, even the mystique of digital may even I can do so much more, and digital is going to do that lift. We talk about, I think people are afraid AI is going to take my job. And then we're seeing that as some of the resistance to digital as well, is the hype around it. And so it's if I do this transformation, it will cut my workforce. So I don't really need to upskill them all. I'll figure that out on the other end. And then that undermines the digital transformation. And so I'm a firm believer in that. It just because of the perspective I work from, that we need to bring people along on the journey sooner in the conversation and in the transformation, so that those different mindsets and different ways of working actually get built into the digital transformation and power it, as opposed to trying to be retrofit into the organization later.
The reality is that once the technology is turned on, how they do their job will change. And if they're not ready for that day one, then you've just delayed the successful implementation of this technology, because now you're trying to figure out, well, how do I do my work differently, right? And how has automation changed what's expected of me? What does my day in the life actually look like now? And the more you can communicate that up front and bring them along, the easier it is when the technology gets turned on and they have to start doing their work differently.
Moving into organizational investment, our research found that 69% of companies favor long-term multi-year transformation initiatives, but only 30% of companies are willing to invest in projects with long-term ROI. I mean, it's a classic short-term, long-term, how do you want to approach? Can you talk about, what you've seen that, does that jive with what you've seen with clients, that there's a desire for that long-term project, but there might not be a tolerance or a comfort with taking the long view?
That in most of the reports we deliver to clients as we're helping them assess and create the roadmap, there's a quick win bucket, right? Because you've got to have some things that come out of the gate. They're very easy to do. I like to use a prioritization matrix with my clients where we look at not only the impact of doing something, but the level of effort to do it, right? And how quickly can you get some of these things done that are high impact, even in some cases, if they're symbolic gestures, right? These are really quick wins that show people we're serious and we're going to do this, and we've got to get it out the door early and get that buy-in. So we always build in the quick wins, right? And then we build in the medium term wins. Like, what do you need to do in the medium term? And then what is a longer term vision, and really help with that. The road mapping of this is so key. But I have to say, I'm laughing because I had a client just recently on a project where we said, this is a multi-year journey. And he said, great, but you have until February 5th.
And that sounds about right.
Yes. And I said, okay, how about February 29th, right? Because it's leap year next year. We could take that extra day. And he said, no, February 5th. Like, you guys, you work with my team and you guys get it done. And we're like, alrighty then, So, you've got to meet the clients where they are, right? And be realistic and thoughtful about the strategies we give them. We can always tell them what's best practice, but then we have to figure out what will really work for their organization. And they said, well, we've done these multi-year transformations and people leave and priorities change and, things happen. And, we don't want to do this multi-year. We want a big bang approach. And it's like, all right, well, let's talk about what that means and let's prepare for those risks.
Yeah. I want to challenge the underlying assumption even behind that. And that is the idea that you can have that a digital transformation can be short-term or a long-term event. Because if we think about the digital mindset, it's not an event, right? A project is an event. A product is a continual evolution. And so if we start taking that project to product mindset shift to the whole organization, then the digital transformation is done in releases, and those releases can be monthly, quarterly, annually. And this is where digital transformation, we're going to go back to where we started. The vision matters, just like a product vision matters. What am I going to build? For whom? What's the value I'm going to create? How's that value going to be differentiated? And putting that out. And so I would say companies need to have a long-term vision. What is that point on the horizon that we're steering towards, or sailing towards? Because you can't sail upwind, right? You have to tack a lot. And so if you have that point on the horizon and then you start implementing, and organizations are going to tack back and forth, and it may not look like a linear journey, but you're going to be releasing incrementally and then periodically looking back and saying, one, do I still have that vision? What have I learned in the last 12 months that might change my vision? And then moving along. And so this is where you can't outsource that to like another group within the company and hope they'll bring it back, because in a really digital transformation, it's not an event, it's a way of life for the organization. And we're evolving together through these incremental releases into the business that add up over time. And that's a commitment to just a different way of running a business, and not just a project that we're going to do and then we'll get back to business as usual. We'll stabilize and we'll stop, because that's the antithesis of digital.
I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this analogy that was just playing through my mind of, are people looking for a crash diet when in fact what they should be looking for is a lifetime of healthy habits? That product is really that mindset is really making good choices forever, not, doing something drastic in the short term.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, right? Because how many people go on a crash diet and they lose 20 pounds and 12 months later, they're 30 pounds, 30 pounds gained back. And organizations do that. We see it, right? They get in this oscillating structure where they do a transformation and then they do another one and they do another one. And they don't add up to the sum of their investments. Each one's a slightly different one. And sometimes they gain back that weight that they lost in the original crash diet and then some.
Well, and I think this goes back to what Rick was saying about why only 30% of organizations are successful. The amount of discipline and stay the course that it requires, not every organization has that, and the ability to say this is a lifestyle change. This is not a short-term initiative.
I don't blame them. My diet was just as successful.
Okay, so we are wrapping up now. I've got two last questions for you. So we asked executives to define digital, and the responses were evenly split across various options. Only 30% seem to understand that digital encompasses the whole organization and not just the point solutions or back office processes. How can companies move the needle on the mindset?
Well, I feel like that's really the sum of today's conversation, right? I mean, honestly, we've talked about so many different ways that you can affect the way the employees see themselves on this journey, from how they're incentivized, how they're rewarded, the culture of the organization, things like that. Really just thinking about how you bring them along from the start in terms of what their mindset needs to be and preparing them, right? Being realistic about this is the journey we're on. This is the transformation. This is your role. This is how long it will take. And even to Rick's point, it may never be over. Like, we're on a continual journey. This is an iterative cycle of digital transformation. So being realistic up front.
And Rick, I'd love to hear from you. Do you have an example of a client who's really done this successfully?
I think digital transformation happens in pieces. So we've got a lot of clients who have done this successfully a bit at a time. I'm trying to think of the examples of maybe kind of mundane work with a company that successfully, transformed its technology organization. And brought in managed services providers so that they could augment their skill sets and transforming that function to be more digital, to provide better service to the business. And that was just a baby step into preparing it to have the skill sets to then start adding on new capabilities. So I can look to that organization. I can look to another organization that I'm working with right now in retail. They're transforming their structure and the way they operate the stores and the processes. And that's making it possible to do more cross-training of people and to introduce more digital tools and to transform front-end experience. And they're taking all of these baby steps. And so the incremental changes are all successful. Now, the question that we'll have to see is it's going to take time to see how those add up. And if they continue to have the organizational will to do that journey. So far, they're managing to be pretty successful in that. And so how we measure that, it will wait to be seen, but they're taking on pretty ambitious visions, but they're doing it, in these measured steps that they can get some wins at, that they can get some real value created at and add to it a little bit at a time. And that's where we're seeing real results.
Okay, last question. This is the question that all of our podcast guests receive. My final question to you is, what does digital mean to you?
Something more than just technology, for sure, right? I mean, it really is a mindset like we've been talking about. It's that sense, it's using a digital approach to be connected, to facilitate interactions and communication and, create a set of experiences and how we get our work done. And it also helps us to be more efficient and more effective. If we really think about being digital in the sense of how can we better enable ourselves to be successful in what we need to do, whether it's in our personal life or professional life, we all have examples of where things being digital have just made our lives easier, but allowed us to connect better and collaborate and communicate better too.
For me, being digital is about using the tools to really drive some simplification in the mundane and really take the mundane out of the process so that we can focus on people contributing the unique value that we have as people. The computational power that we uniquely possess that hasn't been replicated, in silicon yet, and the ability to relate to one another, to connect to one another, to influence one another. Digital is what is freeing us up to really bring the human side into the business more than before, because there's nothing more dehumanizing than mundane work. So if we can really use technology to allow people to be human at work and let the computers be computers and let the digital tie us together and make us better. And I think that's the opportunity of being digital.
Well, Rick and Kim, thank you so much for joining today's episode of This is Digital.
Thanks for having us. This was fun. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to This is Digital. If you enjoyed today's show, please follow or subscribe on your preferred podcast app. And don't forget to leave us a review. For more information on This is Digital, visit westmonroe.com/thisisdigital.